This car in front of us is already considered scrapped. But for the craftsmen in Peshawar, Pakistan, it's just a minor scratch or dent. With a bit of tapping and hammering, they can transform it into a beautiful, almost new car. At this moment, the craftsmen have dismantled the vehicle down to its frame. Their first plan is to repair the A-pillar and the roof, but this is no easy task. Due to the lack of proper tools, they can only correct the hard parts using screws. For the thinner parts of the roof's metal sheet, they need to use a hammer to shape it. However, the most challenging part is undoubtedly the repair of the front longitudinal beams. Given the limitations, without a beam correction machine, they need to gradually support it out using screws. For the parts that are flipped outward, they cleverly use a hoist for traction and repositioning. Fortunately, the deformation of the left longitudinal beam is relatively minor. After slightly pulling it to the right position, it only needs some minor corrections with a hammer. The longitudinal beam on the impacted side is severely deformed. Therefore, they first need to remove the shock absorber assembly. Only then can they use screws to support the deformed parts. This process may seem cumbersome, but it is extremely difficult. It requires seamless cooperation among several craftsmen and multiple operations. The corrected parts are first fixed with a hoist to prevent them from being overstretched when correcting the front part. This process also requires simultaneous heating and hammering. However, after several attempts, they still did not succeed. So, the next day, they had to fix the frame on a simple rack. This rack served as a makeshift pull tower for pulling and shaping. After pulling it into the approximate shape, they corrected it with a hammer. After a whole day of effort, the craftsman finally fixed the front part. But since this car had previously been subjected to front and rear impacts, the deformation at the rear was also quite severe. Thus, they needed to use the same method and technique to correct the rear. What is most admirable is their patience. Those wrinkled iron sheets were all restored by hammering, truly a process of repeated tempering. If they had a puller, it would save a lot of time. It took them a whole day just to make the bodywork look smooth. For the rear longitudinal beam, they still needed to use a hoist to pull it back into place, and then heat it for correction. To better refine the waistline, the craftsmen now need to draw the waistline on the body and then correct it. Once the rear is fixed, they can install the trunk lid. They initially thought that once the trunk lid was installed, they could start painting. Unexpectedly, the craftsman said that the roof and A-pillar were severely deformed and needed to be removed for repair. So, to speed up the progress, the craftsmen divided the work. 2 craftsmen used a handsaw to cut the roof while another was responsible for cutting the A-pillar. After the cutting was complete, they removed the crossbeam of the roof and took out the roof. It took the craftsmen 2 whole days to repair this roof, and now it looks as good as new. Next, the craftsmen will use oxyacetylene welding for the welding process. After repeated welding and grinding, the roof and the body are perfectly integrated, as if they were originally one piece. Once the bodywork has a general contour, the tail lights can be reinstalled. To save costs, the craftsmen used parts from a disassembled car for the tail lights. After the tail lights are installed, the rear doors can be put back in place. When the rear doors are installed and closed, you can hardly see any gaps, which is impressive bodywork. Once all the preparations are complete, they can apply putty to the uneven areas. Applying putty makes the surface of the bodywork smoother and provides a good foundation for the subsequent painting. The putty also covers small flaws and imperfections, making the repaired body look more aesthetically pleasing. Before installing external components, the craftsman will spray a layer of epoxy primer. Once the primer is sprayed, the bumper can be reinstalled. The putty on the bodywork still needs another round of careful sanding. Meanwhile, other craftsmen start installing the fenders. Once the fenders are installed, the rear bumper and tail lights are also installed. Next is the installation of the rear windshield, completing the installation of the rear components. Now, only the front part of the car is left. First is the installation of the crash beam, followed by the headlights. After the headlights are installed, the bumper is fitted. These parts are relatively easier to install. The difficulty lies in the dashboard with its dense wiring, which is a headache to look at. If the wiring hasn't been modified, there will be corresponding plugs, making it easier. However, installing the steering wheel is more delicate work. A slight mistake can damage the airbag's clock spring. But for this car, the presence of an airbag is not important anymore. A steering wheel and seats are sufficient. After all the interior components are installed, it's time for the most critical installation, the engine and transmission assembly. Due to the lack of a lifting jack on site, the craftsman had to push the vehicle over a pit and cleverly use a hoist to maneuver the engine into the engine bay. This way, the craftsmen can work together from above and below. In less than a day, the craftsman successfully installed the components in the engine bay. Next, the vehicle will enter the final painting stage. Before this, the craftsman carefully masked the areas that do not need painting to ensure that no other areas are accidentally sprayed during the painting process. After a week of bodywork repair, the vehicle now shines with a new luster.